Hello, everybody, and welcome to this video cast in the framework of our project Light. Youth Work sheds light on unconscious bias and invisible racism. This project collects and distributes know-how designed to help people recognize and prevent unconscious bias from harming their society. It is a pan-European project created in partnership with NGOs in France, Italy, Greece, and Poland. I am George Weiss, Director of Radio La Benevolencia Humanitarian Tools Foundation, a Dutch NGO devoted to the fight against incitement to hatred and violence in the framework of identity-based violence. Our guest in this videocast is Professor Mario Fumerton, who is Assistant Professor at the Center for Conflict Studies in the Department of History at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. He has done fieldwork and archival research in Peru, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, and Iraq, and his research interest focuses on militias, civilian defense groups, non-state socio-political actors in the midst and in the aftermath of armed conflict, and in rebuilding peaceful coexistence after violent political conflict. And it's there that unconscious bias might come in even more. Since 2012, he has additionally served as a consultant, trainer, and advisor evaluator for projects in Afghanistan and Iraqi Kurdistan, supported by various Dutch ministries and non-governmental organizations. Welcome, Professor Fumerton.
Thank you for inviting me, George.
All right. I will address you not as Professor Fumerton, but as
Please
Mario.
don't.
Will
Yeah,
make our talk a little bit easier. But
yes.
our work and your research definitely holds importance for the wider implications around unconscious bias, and this is why we have invited you here. Um, I would start as we with a definition of unconscious bias, the kind of definition that you would prefer giving. We would like to hear that. Could you?
My definition, if you don't mind, because I need to kind of lead up to the definitions for the
Right.
definition to make sense. So just sort of cut me off. I'll give you about a couple of minutes of background, and then cut me off and say, okay, now get to my definition. Okay. So first of all, let me just begin with a caveat. I'm neither an expert or cognitive or neurosciences expert, nor am I a psychologist, philosopher, or scholar that specializes on the theme of bias, but bias does enter my own research and teaching. So I think it's important so that the audience understands where I'm coming from, my angle. I'm a social realist, which means that I believe in an external reality, but one that exists through the mediation of our perceptions of it. In other words, our human cognition, the way we think, and our communication creates representations of an external reality. So, for example, the external reality that we call time, we represent that with, let's say, a wristwatch, right? But that's not time itself. Okay, so human perception then is the starting point for how I understand and define bias. Human perception is the result of creating representations of our external reality through language. As such, we are very filtered and selective in our observations of reality. I mean, we can make a distinction between seeing the external world and actually observing. So what I mean is, for example, if there's a flight of stairs at your work, you see that every single day. But I ask you, okay, well, then tell me how many steps are there in your flight of stairs? You'll not tell me that because you were seeing, but you weren't focusing on that, right? So, which shows that you're not always receiving everything equally, right? We filter and we're selective. And finally, it's important to understand that in the process of perception, we are actually trying to make meaning of the world around us, both inside us, an intersubjective world, but also the physical, external physical world. So human perception is embedded and shaped within a social cultural milieu in which the individual is born. We are born into norms, traditions, social values, cultures, and knowledge systems. We have no choice in creating that. We're born into it, right? So, as such, humans are, in my opinion, we're not born with biases. we are taught, we learn, and we are socialized biases in the social settings and institutions where we live in our lives. Okay.
Good.
Um,
So
so,
what, as you gave me the, yeah, all right, please continue. One second. Once more,
okay.
but we're getting to the definition right here.
Yes, yes. And as such, all of us, as socialized beings, we carry biases. And this is important because to say that I'm not biased is itself a bias. Okay. So, biases, at least to some degree, is always present in the language based communication of human beings. So, language is always embedded within a social cultural milieu with its cultural biases. So, given this, sort of grounding in human perception, um, what would be my definition of bias? My definition of bias is that it is a cognitive disposition from which some type of logical fallacy or error in judgment, estimation, or representation arises. So I'll repeat that again. It's a cognitive disposition, which means it's part of our way of thinking, but it's also sort of just our inclination from which some type of error in our judgment or what's called a logical fallacy arises in judgment, estimation, or representation of the world around us. Okay.
Okay.
So why did I do that? Is because, in fact, it's important when we look at the definition for bias, which I did for in preparation for this show. Um, First of all, the word is very often assumed as kind of self-evident. So I've looked at, for example, 5 or more of my research methodology books, and yes, they do talk about bias, but they'll give you specific types of bias without actually defining what is bias, right? The other thing too is that I couldn't find a universally accepted definition that all scholars are working from. And it's important to recognize that the idea of bias, it's actually a comparative sort of idea, right? Like it's comparative because and binary, because when you say something is or someone is biased, you are assuming that there is such a thing as an unbiased baseline, right?
There
uh,
is a negative connotation. That's
yeah,
true.
yes. So but then the question arises, how do we measure this unbiased baseline? Who decides what is an unbiased baseline? And you know, I think that we have this notion that there is such a thing as the unbiased because we have other words that are the binary opposites, such as objectivity, right? And in practice, we're hoping that the judges who sit in our court cases are objective individuals. So there's this assumption that objectivity can be somehow reached, right? And I think that part of the problem when I was looking for the definition of bias is how do you actually distinguish the term bias from other similar sorts of words like preference, like, dislike, or inclination? So if I say I prefer fish when the waiter asks me, "Do you want meat or fish?" I say, "I prefer fish." Fish. Does that mean that's a bias? Is that the same sort of idea if I say I hate, Canadians, right? Um,
Obviously not.
so the
Obviously
word,
not. So what is
yeah.
it?
So the words, the definitions that I was finding were not really helping in this sense. Like, for example, I found an academic definition that says bias is a kind of leaning or an inclination or a predisposition, which means in my head, well, what's the difference then? If it's a kind of this, what is it, right? Because in what way then is bias different from, for example, a predisposition? That's why I created my own definition by actually linking it, looking at the literature. There was a lot of connections being made to what in philosophy and rhetoric are called logical fallacies. So these are fallacies in the construction of arguments, right? And because I couldn't find a better definition, I come up with, let's go back to my definition. It's a cognitive disposition, something that's sort of, you feel that it's ingrained in your thinking, from which That means to say the consequence of having that little seed in your head, from which some type of logical fallacy or error in judgment, estimation, or representation arises. So people who have these ingrained, whether they're conscious, such as racists, like KKK members, they're quite aware of their racism, or unconscious, if they try to construct an argument about, for example, the choice they made, by knowing that there might be a logical fallacy in that person's argument, because, as I said, language is very, very important for perception, and we talk about the world around us through language. So as critical consumers, or someone who is having a discussion with someone else, and we might be, for example, concerned that, okay, this person seems to have bias in their argument or the point they're trying to make. We have to understand, okay, in what way is it a bias, right? Because if we think, well, I just don't
Well,
like what that person is saying, that itself is a bias, right?
okay, but let's then try to understand, because I mean, we can discuss, of course, the different nuances of
Yes.
how to take a look at that. But you said two important things. There is a predisposition somewhere. Where does that come from? Because are we born with predispositions? And how can we? I mean, when we say somebody is biased, I mean, the one thing that we don't count on is positive bias, because we usually mean it negatively. But it seems like we naturally can distinguish. We can distinguish from, oh, I want fish at this moment, and I am predisposed forever to to fish. That would
Right.
be a bias if the word forever would be connected to it.
Right.
So what is this? What is this predisposition that we're talking about?
Well, my own informed position is that we are born without biases. So you can, as a test, it
You
would
just
probably.
said we're not born with our biases. You
So
were
no,
just
no, no,
saying
no, 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 no. I said we are born without biases,
about
but we are
bias.
socialized into being biased, right?
Oh,
Okay. So that's the important point, is we're born, and as a test of this, you can have twins, right? And you separate them by birth. One goes to this society and the other goes to another society. And you would look and see what kind of people they are in 20 years. And actually there are sort of tests like these that have been done in the past. People who, twins who've been separated by birth and whatever, and they might encounter themselves in the future, and they can be quite different individuals. So clearly it's not a biological or some kind of neurological source in which we find bias. So we are born without bias, but we are through, as I said earlier, that's why it was important to have the sort of the preface there. It, we are born and embedded in a social cultural milieu
is
in
that
which
the predisposition? Is that our predisposition that we would look at our cultural?
yes, absolutely. That's where our cognitive predispositions come from, right?
Okay.
Of course, there might be, as I said, like as I said in the beginning, I'm not a cognitive or neuroscientist or psychologist or psychiatrist. I mean, where do certain, let's say, serial killers, where do they get their predisposition? So there's something more, but I mean, for
Well,
all of us,
I
right?
think it can be pretty easy to understand that we are predisposed towards adapting to our group. Yes.
That's right. That's
Could you
right.
could you then say that biases come from our group? Are they conditioned through groupthink, or
Well, sure,
clearly
you.
there are some other cases when you have bad experiences that make you biased?
Yes. I think that the group is very important because the group dynamics reinforces bias. But then the question would be, where does that group get its bias, right? Um, and for most of us in our ordinary daily lives, it's just, as I said, the social cultural milieu in which we're born. If you're born in Dutch society, you will probably carry all these biases. You'll probably, I don't know, sing Franz Bauer and all this kind of stuff, you know. these are things that you're born into. But there are some groups that we in life, either we are brought into without our consent, for example religious groups, or we in our adult life we might choose to join a group, right? I might choose to join anything from, you know, ecology defense group or a communist party or whatever, right? So within those groups, of course, the group itself has certain internal rules, practices, rituals that socialize the individual into the identity, the values, and they have to express through continued socialization and participation, they have to express their loyalty to the group, right?
Okay, but what about somebody who gets uh, into a violent incident with somebody from another ethnic group, and therefore starts having resentment towards that ethnic group? That doesn't depend on his group, does it? Or her group?
No, no, no. That's why I in my definition. I'm glad you asked that, because that actually hopefully shows the value of my definition. One of these let me just again read out the definition. Bias is a cognitive disposition from which some type of logical fallacy or error in judgment, estimation, or representation arises. So what you've said to me, like imagine just an ordinary person, right? Like maybe even they thought, well, I support multiculturalism. Okay. That individual gets mugged. Okay. By someone else. Let's say someone else is a Canadian. Okay. He gets mugged by a Canadian. And then in that person's mind, then they start saying Canadians are criminals, right? So this is actually a logical fallacy. It's called a hasty generalization. Okay. A hasty generalization is drawing a conclusion based on limited information or personal experience and then generalizing it to the entire group. So, in that way, yeah,
Hmm.
it's not some ideology or some external group that has socialized you. It's your own tragic personal experience that creates that kind of bias.
Okay, so I understand that the key word here is fallacy. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean,
Or
if
error in judgment. That's the other part. Or error in judgment.
error
Yeah.
in judgment. And that is why we are I mean, let's face it, this is why we are dealing with bias right now,
Yes.
in order to avoid errors and in order to avoid fallacies.
Yeah.
Now, but just before we get to how to do that, can we, because you said also something important, you tried uh, to generalize the word bias so that it does not only, I mean, we talked earlier so that we saw that bias it does not only need to be negative. Yeah.
That's right. I agree
Now,
with that
now,
completely. Yeah.
now, now, in your definition, it sounds pretty negative, I must say. See, if we take the word fallacy, logical, wrong conclusions, things like that, well, is there then is a positive bias not a logical wrong conclusion?
Well, I think that you can have a positive bias, but um,
Wait
I'm
a second.
actually in my definition, I'm actually avoiding these quite normative uh, sort of points of reference like negative, positive, good, bad, right? I think that if we play in that ballpark, then my definition is lost. But I think that the ballpark is in itself, it's creating a skewed ground or arena in which to think critically about bias, right? We could even, if we want, we can think, well, like violence, we can see violence as something that's renewing. It's actually quite positive and all this. And so, I mean, that's part of I think the way that we can use language to twist and bend and use rhetoric to prove whatever we want to say, which in itself is bias. I actually believe
Ah,
that,
yeah,
yeah,
great.
I believe that bias is something that I wouldn't say negative or positive. It creates logical fallacies in our argumentation, right? And also creates errors in judgment. So even if it's a positive bias, it will still create an error in judgment.
So can we give some examples of positive bias? Because I
Well,
think that may be a bit of an unusual
I,
statement in terms
well,
of our
because
audience, speaking
yeah,
of bias.
if you don't mind, I mean, you're interviewing me, but I'm gonna throw it back at you and say, because I don't work from negative, positive, good, bad as sort of my axes of determination, can you give me a definition or an example of a positive bias?
Well, I think that we see in a lot of European societies the belief that the society is good. Yeah. So a liberal society. Oh, that we are living in the Netherlands. So a Dutch person usually thinks about his value system or her value system as something good. And in my opinion, that would be a positive bias. Would that,
Right.
or it would be a bias. Let's abandon positive.
Yes. Yeah. See, the thing is this is
It-
to attach a normative value to that as something positive. I could actually say, well, number one, that's very normative and unrealistic. Number two, it can actually show the naivety in for example, the consequences of good intentions. And number three, I can give you a very good example of how these good intentions or assumptions, which some people in other parts of the world would actually say, well, that's you're just justifying a new colonialism.
Mm,
They will say it was because of these neoliberal, normative driven liberal peace ideas that, in fact, you had invasions in parts of the world, like, for example, overthrowing the dictators in Iraq or Libya. Right, when they couldn't find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, then they went to this normative argument of, well, we're liberating the women of Iraq. Right, that's why we're here. So you can say, oh yeah, that's a positive bias, but when you see the negative consequences of that invasion, I mean, Iraq, in many ways now is in worse position, like in terms of some parts of the infrastructure or the quality of education, than it was in the 1980s under Saddam Hussein. I mean, that's a fact. Okay, so the positive so-called positive bias, because it wasn't actually placed and allowed to be traced out in a historical process, it just ends up as a normative statement where you see again the negative consequences of naive good intentions. I would say that if you put that through my definition, I would say that because of this cognitive disposition that we are here to spread democracy in the Middle East through overthrowing these dictators, we're going to increase the, raise the position of women and all this. All of those things are positive things, but because of those cognitive dispositions, what you saw was an error in judgment. I do firmly believe that it was an error in judgment for the United States and its coalition allies to invade Iraq. I think that that was absolutely an error of judgment. The fact that they withdrew their attention from Afghanistan, which was going on at the same time, right? It's another question whether that invasion was, a good judgment or not. But I mean, the fact that they drew their attention away from Afghanistan to Iraq actually results, 20 years later in going back to not only point zero, which is that the Taliban are once again the ones ruling Afghanistan, but the advancement of women during that 20-year period has actually gone to negative values now in the current Afghanistan.
Okay, Mario, at this point, I want to go back to simpler things than world geopolitics.
Yeah, that's my conflict studies
Yeah,
background coming
it
in,
is,
right?
and it is a very interesting subject. But let's just go back to saying, I'm a good person, this is a bad person.
Mm.
According to what you are saying, actually, these normative judgments shouldn't be there. Uh, and how then should we relate to these kind? So, and if I understand correctly, saying I'm a good person, this is a bad person, are both biases. Yes? If I
Yes,
understand correctly.
yes, because definitions of good and bad have changed over the decades,
Okay,
right?
okay. So they're both biases.
Yeah.
So how then should we treat our norms and values? Should we doubt them or should we stick to them? Where's the dividing line between something saying, oh, this is just a bias and this is something that we should go by?
Well, I think that for me, there are a number of things that have to be balanced here. I personally, I do not believe at all in other people imposing their norms and biases on my thoughts, right? I can think whatever I want, and those are my thoughts. Um, for me, when some kind of external intervention or participation starts to become um, valid, is when my thoughts start turning into actions, uh, behaviors, and practices which are harmful to others.
Okay, that's also normative, but we accept that as human beings, we don't want to harm other people. But it is a normative judgment as well.
Well, it's also a physical thing, right? I mean,
Well,
if
the Nazis, the
I punch
Nazis,
some, yeah,
the Nazis, for example, had
yeah,
different norms where you could hurt others and the stronger survives. And according to those norms, you could harm others.
sure, and therefore I would say that those biases, I mean, those those practices came out of dispositions, cognitive dispositions, biases, right? So the Nazis did not create anti-Semitism, right? Hitler became very popular because it was already there, and of course, in Europe, anti-Semitism has been around for centuries, right? But
And
it's when that
the cognitive disposition was
was
anti-Semitic.
already there. So it's when that translates, because it's still there, right? I mean, in the Netherlands, there are lots of people who are probably anti-Semitic and anti whatever.
Yeah.
But in my for me, as long as those don't actually become used for inciting violence, I think that's the value of freedom of thought and freedom of speech for me is just as high as the idea of, let's say, reducing bias.
Okay, fine. But then in that case, how shall we deal with that? How shall we? Because I mean, the thing is, we are here looking at bias
Yes,
because, for example, in a job interview, you have to beware of in your language, cognitive dispositions.
yes,
Yes.
yes.
So if we can say, okay, everything is a cognitive disposition and biases are good and bad, well, why should we beware of them? We're not going to hurt a person in a job interview if I if I look at a person and I don't like the sort of ethnic type that the person is or the gender that the person is. That's my cognitive disposition. I realize it's a cognitive disposition, but the job interview is going the way it is. There are also I might prefer somebody else whom I like, and those are just cognitive dispositions. Do I misunderstand something here?
Yeah, I think so. I think so because, for example, if the person is truly qualified, right,
Yeah.
and you do not hire them, and but they're not only qualified, but they're the best candidate, right? You think you haven't harmed. You think, oh, well, what's the consequence of that? But that person might have been struggling, trying, for example, to come out of, let's say, mental illness, right? And you are, the 25th person who, because of these other biases, maybe the person is half burnt and you don't like that. Oh my God, it's so ugly, right? I don't hire you. Maybe that person's psychological self-esteem is in fact being damaged by every single rejection of, in their interview, even though they think, how am I being interviewed? I just won, 2 years ago, before I was burnt, I just won the Nobel Prize in whatever, right? And these people are telling me that there's someone better. Do you not see the damage of that? So I think that also we need to be, as individuals, we need to go beyond simply the obvious. What is the physical damage that our thoughts and actions inflict, but there are also unseen, unobservable damages. Now, I
Could you
think
could
that
you could you could you resume this actually in one sentence, in one statement about why biases should be disregarded in one way or another?
I don't know if that's not my point. I wouldn't say that they're disregarded, because I
Not
think that
disregard.
they are as again, let me say, as socialized individuals, biases are as ingrained within us as our own skin, right? So it's not like I
We shouldn't
disagree.
disregard them.
I totally disagree that we can, go up to a mountain, meditate, and then all of our biases just disappear. That we're just pure
Okay,
light, or so.
so
I disagree.
I
However,
said this
yeah,
on purpose, by the way, because I'm trying to lead us slowly because you already moved towards that in what can be done in order to deal with our
I
bias.
think that the best thing that can be done is for us to actually be more sensitive and more aware that we have biases, without believing that somehow we can completely cleanse ourselves of biases, which is an impossibility, right? As a matter of fact, I think that it becomes even most dangerous when people believe that if you do this or that, you will be completely cleansed, because sometimes those people end up to be very cultish, and even, like, they start saying that they are the next prophet, or the embodiment of God, and whatever. Like, there are these cults that revolve around personalities, and those individuals, they beguile their followers, because they say, "Look, I have done this, and I am now completely cleansed of whatever." Right, such as biases. So that kind of thinking, that kind of cognitive process, I think actually is really dangerous, because it can create a situation where the person thinks that they are somehow morally superior to the other people who haven't done whatever they did, right? So if we just accept, hey, we all will encounter bias, we all have biases in ourselves. Like, objectivity, I believe, is possible, but not general objectivity, in the sense that you can have a chess player, like, for example, was I don't know, Kasparov, you know, who used to play chess with himself. If you're biased, you know, your whites, if you're biased to your whites, you'll create little mistakes with your black, that so that you can defeat the black, right? So these people were able to play chess by themselves, but as a entire human being, of course, in their other aspects of their life, they exercise bias, right? So I believe that if we can move towards things like, okay, what can you do, or identify recommendations, I think that the first important thing is to recognize that everybody carries biases, and it's not something that we can completely strip from ourselves. That's the
So
first
when
thing.
so when you are a job interviewer for
Yeah.
somebody coming to a job interview, how shall you deal with your bias?
I
Right.
think that being aware, first of all, that there are biases, um, listening to the individual's responses, right? Um, if they exhibit, for example, a logical fallacy, if you say, okay, it says here that in your statement or whatever, that you're against vaccines, okay? and the person says, yes, yes, I'm against vaccinations because vaccinations don't work because they're ineffective. In
Right.
my head, I would say, this person just told me a circular, what's called circular reasoning, which is one of these logical fallacies. And so if I reject that person, I have a reason why I reject, and not just, I don't know, je ne sais quoi, I felt something. Like I'm saying, this person is not, in terms of the thinking, right? The thinking process, this person is actually not, you know, thinking in logical ways, and that's a very concrete reason why I don't give that individual, because the position is for an analyst. Anyone who's making these kind of errors, right, is not going to be a good analyst, especially
True.
if they're not even aware that they've made the error, right? So I think
Right.
that's
So, and
familiarizing yourself with these logical fallacies, and you can find lots of information online about these logical fallacies. And we realize, oh my goodness, like we perpetrate these fallacies all the time, every day. Anytime someone says to you, this happened, and you say, really, I don't believe that. That's called the incredulity fallacy, right? Like where your refusal to believe is itself the truth, right? I mean, like we do that every day, actually,
yeah. So actually, I think that actually works quite well. But I mean, is there any simple way we can do this? I mean, I just hope that we can teach individuals to
I think if,
understand.
yeah, I think
Mm,
if there was a simple way, it wouldn't be such a hard problem, right?
that's right.
I think the first step would be for us to be humble and actually do some introspection of ourselves. Because if we actually think that, and some do, I'm sure there must be, university professors or presidents of the United States that just think that they cannot make errors, right?
Yeah,
So if you begin from that position, then there's no way to make that person a bit more aware or sensitive to these things. So another thing that's important is to move away from your intentions. Again, that's why I don't like good, bad, positive, negative, because someone will, for example, the whole Zwarte Piet debates. Remember that we've had for
yeah,
almost a decade, if not more. The the supporters of Zwarte Piet said, well, it's not our intention for Zwarte Piet to be racist. So that in itself is also, in fact, a fallacy, because it's appeal to intention. It's saying, my intention is that it's not racist, therefore it's not racist, right? I mean, that's completely disregarding, again, in a kind of like quite an insensitive way, how it makes other people feel, right? So your intentions are, in my opinion, irrelevant if your bias causes harm to someone. Of course, we need to then, in a responsible way, define what harm is, legitimate harm or valid harm, right?
sure.
Because some people will say, like you use the word he, that offends me. I think, okay, that's really taking something too far, taking it to its illogical conclusion if you go far enough, right? But if, for example, your intention is to, I don't know, just to slap, this noisy uh, immigrant child in the train because they're making a nuisance for everybody. The fact that you have assaulted them by slapping them, that is, that's caused harm to someone, and you can't say, yeah, but my intention was to quiet down the train, so that everyone can enjoy the silence. So that's a second recommendation. I think that's to familiarize oneself with these logical fallacies. I think it really helps. I, because why? It's because there are some biases which are so obvious, right? Those are not the important biases, in my opinion. Like anyone who's consciously racist, right? They're not biased. They've chosen to be racist. You can't say, oh, like I'm using the N word all the time. I didn't, as a white person or, non-colored black person, you can't say, oh, I wasn't aware that that was racist, right? So it's those very overt, obvious, and conscious biases. Those are not the important ones. It's actually the ones that are unconscious, subconscious, or yeah, we're just not aware of them. Those are the ones that are, in my opinion, the most important ones to try to tackle with a definition like this. Because, for example, I have a lot of university students who do research, right? But they are, in the way that they're doing their research, they are, or writing up their thesis or whatever, they are actually committing a lot of these logical fallacies in the way that they're thinking. Like, for example, confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is all right to have your conclusion in mind, and then you just go out and cherry pick the data to support that. And there are students who sometimes are not even aware that what they're doing is a bias, right? So it's those kind of things that are more sort of more subtle, that in fact are the most important biases, I think, to try to tackle. Critical thinking, try to be more self-critical to be able to recognize if you're acting with some kind of partiality, one-sidedness. Also, we must, especially in this day and age with social media and false information and all this kind of misinformation, we really have to be critical of our sources of our belief, right? Very often, with AI now, I've seen manipulated videos where you think, oh my goodness, I mean, you know, this is happening. A male dog is giving birth to pups, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, uh, a
So
lot
how
of,
do so just because in order
yeah,
we only have limited time for this
yes,
interview, and I think it is extremely interesting to hear your examples and to hear uh, your modes of advising us on how to be careful with your biases. Uh, I noticed that you had possibly made notes for yourself on your recommendations. Is that correct?
yes,
Well, in order to keep our time frame, I think it is extremely important to hear your recommendations on how to deal with our biases one by one. Maybe
yeah.
in
Oh,
terms of your
actually, I'd already been for the past
you've already
five or
told
minutes. I've
them.
already been reading them out.
So
Actually, those
can we just
recommendations.
summarize them
Yeah.
one by one as an endpoint to this interview?
Yes. Okay. First of all, I think that it's important to look inside ourselves as the starting point, right?
Right.
Next, I think that if we are able to actually identify, so that we can have a little bit more of a clear, concrete reason why we think
Mhm.
we are encountering a bias in ourselves or in a bias in someone else. I think that if we can familiarize ourselves with these logical fallacies that cause errors in judgment, I think that that really can go a long way. There was a time, I think, in school many decades ago, when this was part of a course called rhetoric. Like, students actually learned how to argue. There were, even when I was in school, in high school and elementary school, we even had debating societies and stuff where these things were taught, but I think they're not taught anymore. I think that also we really have to try to exercise critical thinking and try to recognize when the rhetorical purpose of things that other people say, which you find appealing, right? When those are actually based on assumptions and claims instead of facts, right? Like, you might find it appealing to think, well, there actually is no climate change, right? Um, because maybe you want to continue riding your CO2 emitting vehicle for 50 more years or whatever, right? I mean, like, I
You
think that
do.
we have to be aware of the rhetorical purpose when people are telling us that climate change is just a fallacy and not real, right? And then, as I was saying, try to be more self critical and recognize that when you're acting with partiality, one sidedness. unbalanced selection or presentation of information. So we really have to be very careful of the source of information that we have. And that's very difficult these days because I think that, you know, there's a general crisis of authority and credibility that's pervading everything from government to institutions. That's why, for example, you had a lot of these anti-vaxxers coming up with their sources of information. So it's difficult now because science itself is under threat of losing some kind of authority, right? I think that we also have to be aware when we are temperamental or emotional
Ah,
in making certain judgments, right? And those judgments, because they sometimes people say, well, like your decision should not be determined by what you had for breakfast, right? And the indigestion that you have. Well, in reality, sometimes if we're not feeling well, we're more irritable, less patient, and it does create a bias just to go back home or whatever, right?
so if I, yes, absolutely. Any more recommendations?
Yeah, so those are just a list. And I think my last recommendation is because we live in a world where we like to make statements and listen less to the other. We're making statements to make a point instead of listening. I think that we should always try to ask questions instead of being satisfied with accepting and reproducing statements that we hear from somewhere else.
So these questions one can also ask oneself. Am
Yeah,
I
exactly.
okay? Well, I think that our time is up. We could have continued for hours. I think in this manner
I'm going
there
to
are so
visit you,
many.
and we are going to continue for hours, George.
Yes, I really look forward to that. But I think in terms of the audience of this interview, I think we've covered a lot of important subjects, and I think that basically it is really listen and ask questions to yourself so that you are aware both of your dispositions and of your mental emotional state, if I understand correctly,
Yes,
and awareness of what our group has been enforcing in us, and critical thinking towards all these things, but possibly maintain the bias about of not wanting to harm anyone and of
yes,
being fair.
yes. I would agree with that summary.